Welcome to this, the third part of a series of videos following my epic voyage around South America on the cruise ship Marco Polo. In the previous episode, we'd finally arrived in Brazil and got to visit Rio de Janeiro, where I think it's fair to say we experienced some extremes in weather. In this episode, we join the Marco Polo on its southerly journey down the coast of Brazil, heading for Argentina. From there, we'll be visiting Uruguay and then onto the Falkland Islands. Next stop, Buenos Aires. It's a solitary sea day as we head in a southerly direction just off the coast of Brazil, heading for Argentina. The sea was pleasantly calm and everyone was enjoying some fine weather out on deck. After the torrential downpour we'd experienced in Rio, such tranquility was very welcome. It was a day of work for me, teaching folks how to paint complex buildings in preparation for our next port stop, Buenos Aires. With the roads just beyond the cruise terminal appearing to be in a state of gridlock, we headed off on foot towards a large nature reserve about 40 minutes walk away. Well, this was to be an overnight stop, giving us lots of time to explore the city, day one being all about the nature and the wildlife. It remained stiflingly hot the whole way, and even though I love a bit of wildlife spotting, I must confess the air was so humid I was struggling to keep up with the energy and enthusiasm of the birders who were in their element. For our second day on Argentinian soil, we had a different target in our sights. As we wandered the streets of the city, we admired just how well planned out it seemed to be, and modern in all senses of the word. Our target was Recoleta Cemetery, and as cemeteries go, this one really is quite spectacular. Streets of tombs stretch out in all directions, each structure unique and most adorned with extravagant sculptures. Of all the many hundreds of tombs here, however, one tomb attracts the lion's share of attention. The tomb of the Duarte family, but more specifically, the resting place of one Eva Peron, also commonly known as Evita. Our other target, requiring quite a lengthy hike across the city, was to Congressional Plaza. The plaza is a public park facing the palace of the Argentine National Congress. It's a 7.5-acre open space dominated by the monument to the two Congresses, which celebrates the centenary of the 1816 Declaration of Independence, and is set on a neoclassical esplanade, all of which was completed in 1914. But why the urgent need to visit it, you may be wondering? Well, that would be because this was the subject of my onboard painting class, covering the simplification of complex buildings on our sea day prior to arriving here. I had the class starting out with a loose wet in wet wash, lifting out a smattering of crucial highlights with a scrunched up piece of tissue, and establishing a bunch of basic architectural shapes with a large brush loaded with a mix of grey. My aim was to try and show them how complex architecture doesn't necessarily need to be scary, and that absolute accuracy doesn't have to be the primary objective. Instead, I encouraged them to simply paint what they saw and allow the paint to bleed and blend at its own leisure. As the painting develops, of course, so the finer details need to be added, although even with these we can afford to be selective. Generally speaking, it's always a good idea to leave something to the imagination of the viewer anyway, giving them the opportunity for individual interpretation. Simply put, if you leave stuff out, then your viewer will need to work a little harder to understand it, but in its own subtle way, that makes it a more attractive viewing experience. Well, that's my excuse anyway, and I'm sticking to it. Time in Buenos Aires had come to an end, although our next port of call was literally just across the water, the Rio de la Plata to be precise. A straight line from Buenos Aires to Montevideo in Uruguay is only just over 130 miles, so all being well, we'd be there in the morning. We liked Montevideo. It's a colourful, lively city with music on every corner and people in strange costumes dancing to the rhythm of their soul. Everywhere you look, folks were drinking mate, a herb-like tea drunk through a metal straw and topped up with hot water from a flask. We bought our own mate pot and tried it and didn't really like it much, but there you go. In Uruguay, it's a way of life. Again, we had 2 days here, one day for exploring the city and the other spent escorting an 8-hour tour to Punta del Este. To be honest, other than some giant fingers, I didn't think the place had a great deal going for it. It was a bit like Skeggy, but with good weather and a better beach. The food and drink was also extortionately priced. I did enjoy the Rally Museum though, which featured paintings by Beryl Cook and sculptures by Salvador Dali. Two days at sea, heading almost directly south, brought us to Stanley in the Falkland Islands. For those 2 days, everyone on board had been monitoring the weather situation with some degree of anxiety, knowing just how precarious the issue of whether or not we would actually be able to get ashore can be. Well, as it happened, we needn't have worried. As we dropped anchor in Blanco Bay, a short tender boat's ride from Stanley, it was a great relief to find ourselves surrounded by calm water, bright sunshine and clear blue skies. I'm very grateful to Mark, a resident of Stanley, who contacted me a few weeks previously for his offer of a private tour around the island. He took us in his 4x4 to York Bay and Gypsy Cove, giving us lots of interesting information about the island and answering our barrage of questions about island life. In short, he was the perfect host. I'd expected it to be bleak and cold, and the landscape is certainly wild, but Mark explained to us that this was now their summer, and that days like this, contrary to popular belief back in the UK, are actually quite common. The main thing on my agenda that I was hoping to see was penguins. On the day of our visit, we saw mostly Magellanic and Gen 2 penguins, absolutely loads of them. Well, for my on-board painting classes, however, I chose to have the group painting king penguins. Once I'd applied a loose wet-in-wet wash to establish the background, I lifted out a few crucial penguin-shaped highlights with a piece of scrunched-up tissue. Of course, another approach to this would be to mask out the penguin shapes beforehand, but I always prefer to look for the more organic, spontaneous option, not to mention the fact that I wouldn't dare take masking fluid on board ship for fear of it getting into the carpet. The warm colour on the penguin's chest is a mix of cadmium yellow and cadmium red. The most important thing being to graduate the colour so that it doesn't look too solid. To do that, I'm applying the rich colours at the top and then softening them off with a damp brush, drawing the colour downwards. The dark colour is mixed from French ultramarine and burnt umber, although here again I'm taking great care to try and vary it, lightening it with a damp brush in selected places to help give it a more three-dimensional look and also to convey its slightly reflective qualities. I have to say, penguins really are quite fun to paint. Of course, there's a lot more to the Falklands than just penguins. We were treated to some spectacular coastal scenery and a whole host of various seabirds. Wild rolling moorland, sweeping beaches and tiny harbours dotted with the carcasses of old boats. Naturally, there are many monuments and remnants relating to the terrible events of 1982. As well as relics from that war, we also saw huge guns perched on the tops of hills dating back to earlier conflicts, and the names of ships assigned to the task of helping protect the islands are spelled out in large letters made up from rocks on the opposite side of the bay to Stanley. I'm not sure I knew quite what to expect of the Falklands. It certainly surpassed any expectations I might have had of it. I was even surprised to discover that it is twinned with none other than Whitby in North Yorkshire. On the tender boat back to the Marco Polo, we were able to reflect upon what a fantastic, memorable day we'd had on the island. And the light as we were leaving was quite extraordinary and rather magical. For me, this was the unexpected highlight of the trip so far, and would take some topping. Who could have known then that the next leg of the tour was about to do exactly that?